Picture the North Atlantic at night, not as the chaotic graveyard we know from films, but as it was in those final, quiet hours before history broke apart. The ocean is flat, polished like black marble, stretching endlessly under a sky so clear the stars look like shards of ice. It is April 1912, and the largest moving object ever built by human hands is cutting through the silence, glowing with light, unaware that it is sailing not just toward an iceberg, but toward a century of suspicion. Most of us know the story of the tragedy, the band playing, the flares, the freezing water. But there is another story, one that hides in the shadows of the luxury suites and the smoke of private boardrooms in New York and London. It is a story not of nature's cruelty, but of human calculation. A whisper that suggests the sinking of the Titanic was not merely a maritime disaster, but the most elaborate, expensive, and devastating assassination in history. Aboard this floating palace sleep three men: John Jacob Astor IV, Isidor Straus, and Benjamin Guggenheim. They are titans of industry, possessing wealth that rivals nations. They are also the primary obstacle standing in the way of a new financial world order known as the Federal Reserve. And the man who wants that order, the man who owns the ship, J.P. Morgan. And he, quite conveniently, is not on board. Grab a warm drink and settle in. We are about to drift past the official narrative and into the freezing waters of conspiracy, greed, and a crime that may have reshaped the modern world. If you'd like to follow more investigations like this, consider subscribing for future episodes. To understand the magnitude of this alleged crime, one must first understand that the perfect murder does not look like murder at all. It does not involve a smoking gun, a vial of arsenic, or a shadowed figure in an alleyway. The perfect murder looks like an accident. It looks like bad luck. It looks like the wrath of nature, unavoidable and tragic, leaving behind no forensic evidence because the evidence has dissolved into the salt water or settled 2 miles deep into the Atlantic floor. And in 1912, there was no greater stage for such a disappearance than the RMS Titanic. The central mystery we are investigating is not merely that the ship sank, but that it served as a golden cage for the only men powerful enough to stop a financial revolution. This is the Federal Reserve conspiracy, a theory that has circulated in the margins of history books for decades, suggesting that the sinking was a strategic decapitation of the opposition to the creation of a U.S. central bank. At the heart of this dark theory sits the Club of Jekyll Island, a secret gathering of bankers and politicians that had taken place just 2 years earlier, in 1910 off the coast of Georgia. There, shrouded in absolute secrecy, they drafted the legislation that would eventually become the Federal Reserve Act. Their goal was to centralize American banking, wresting control from the chaotic independent tycoons of the Gilded Age, and placing it firmly in the hands of a select few banking dynasties. The primary architect of this new world was the Morgan banking empire. But there was a problem, a very wealthy, very stubborn problem. 3 men stood as the primary blockade against this plan: John Jacob Astor IV, Isidor Straus, and Benjamin Guggenheim. These were not just rich men, they were the American equivalents of royalty. Their combined wealth was staggering. Astor alone possessed a fortune that, adjusted for inflation, would make modern billionaires look like small business owners. But more importantly, they possessed influence. They were the titans of the old money establishment, men who believed that their personal capital and integrity were the bedrock of the American economy, not a centralized, federally chartered bank that could manipulate currency at will. Rumors of the time suggested that these 3 men were preparing to use their vast resources to block the Federal Reserve legislation in Washington. They had the political connections, the public respect, and the sheer financial liquidity to lobby Congress into a stalemate. As long as they were alive and in the room, the Federal Reserve was a dream that would likely die on the Senate floor. So, how do you remove 3 of the most powerful men on Earth without causing a war? You don't attack them. You invite them to a party. The Titanic was the perfect lure. It was marketed not just as a ship, but as the pinnacle of human achievement, a floating testament to the very industrial might these men represented. It was unsinkable, a word that was thrown around with reckless abandon, acting as a sedative against fear. It promised a voyage of unparalleled luxury, a social event that no member of the elite could afford to miss. To be on the maiden voyage was to confirm one's status at the top of the world, and they all booked passage. Astor, returning from his honeymoon with his young pregnant wife Madeline. Strauss, the owner of Macy's, returning from a winter in Europe with his devoted wife Ida. Guggenheim, the mining magnate, traveling with his mistress. They walked right into the trap, carrying their trunks, their servants, and their false sense of security. But the man who built the trap, the man who owned the International Mercantile Marine Company, the parent corporation of the White Star Line, was J.P. Morgan himself. Morgan was the driving force behind the centralization of banking. He was the one who stood to gain the most from the destruction of the old independent order. And, crucially, he was the one who had the power to control the environment in which these men would travel. The most damning piece of the puzzle, the detail that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, is Morgan's own schedule. He was booked on the Titanic. He had a suite reserved, Suite B-52, the promenade suite, complete with a private deck and a room for his bath. His personal luggage had reportedly already been sent ahead. The ship was essentially his private yacht, a celebration of his monopoly on the Atlantic trade. And then, just before the ship was set to sail, J.P. Morgan cancelled. The official reason given was illness. He claimed he was feeling unwell and needed to take the curative waters at a spa in France. Yet, just days after the ship sailed, he was seen in Aix-les-Bains, appearing perfectly healthy, in high spirits, and certainly not bedridden. He didn't just remove himself, he removed his fine art collection that was slated to be transported on the ship. It was a move of supreme caution, the act of a man who knows that the train he is about to catch is destined to derail. With Morgan safely on dry land, the trap was set. The Titanic sailed with his enemies on board, heading into a stretch of ocean known for ice, at a speed that many experienced captains considered reckless for the conditions. The theory posits that this was not accidental negligence, but a calculated gamble. The ship was pushed to its limits, ignoring ice warnings that were received by the wireless room, a room staffed by operators who worked for a company financially tied to the same interests. If the ship hit ice, the lack of lifeboats, a regulation loophole that Morgan's shipping trust had never bothered to close, would ensure that survival was a mathematical impossibility for the majority of men on board. The rule of women and children first would act as the executioner. Astor, Strauss, and Guggenheim, being men of honor and social standing, would never fight their way into a boat ahead of a woman. Their chivalry was their death sentence, and the architects of this plan knew it. They knew that Astor would stand back. They knew Strauss would refuse to leave while others remained. They knew Guggenheim would dress for dinner and accept his fate. The psychological profiles of the victims were part of the weapon. This makes the Titanic tragedy a crime of environment. The perpetrators didn't need to plant a bomb. They simply needed to create a situation where a disaster was statistically probable and then remove the safety nets. They sent a fragile giant into a field of ice, blinded it by ignoring warnings, and stripped it of enough lifeboats to save its passengers. Then they simply waited for nature to pull the trigger. It creates a chilling picture. The great ship steaming west, carrying the old world's guardians toward their doom. While back in France, the architect of the new world sipped his morning coffee, checking his pocket watch, waiting for the wireless signal that would confirm the path was finally clear. The crime wasn't just the sinking, it was the orchestration of a massacre disguised as a misfortune. And as the Titanic moved deeper into the Atlantic, the cold, dark water was getting ready to swallow the only thing standing between the bankers and the control of a nation. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the script had been written. All that was left was for the lights to go out. To immerse yourself in the crime, you must first breathe the air of the crime scene. But the scene is not just a ship, it is an era. To understand why 3 men might be targeted for elimination, and why the world would accept their deaths as a mere accident, we have to step back into the gilded, suffocating, and magnificent atmosphere of 1912. It was a time that feels almost alien to us now, a period suspended in amber, just before the First World War would shatter the globe's innocence. But in these final years of the Edwardian Age, the world was vibrating with a dangerous kind of confidence. Imagine a society drunk on its own achievements. The Industrial Revolution had morphed into a technological renaissance. We had conquered the dark with electricity, we were conquering the air with fragile biplanes, and we had turned the oceans into highways for floating palaces. There was a pervasive belief, bordering on religious dogma, that mankind had finally tamed nature. God might have created the storms, but engineering had built the umbrella. This hubris is essential to our story because it provides the perfect cover for malice. In a world that believes nothing can go wrong, our saboteur doesn't need to break a machine. He just needs to let human arrogance run its course. Financially, the waters were far more turbulent than the North Atlantic. The United States in 1912 was an economic titan with a fragile heart. There was no central bank, no Federal Reserve to stabilize the currency or bail out failing institutions. The economy ran on the sheer will and liquidity of private bankers, primarily the House of Morgan. Just a few years earlier, during the Panic of 1907, the American banking system had nearly collapsed. It was saved not by the government, but by J.P. Morgan himself, who locked the country's leading financiers in his library and refused to let them leave until they pledged their own money to keep the system afloat. Morgan saved the country, but the experience terrified him. He realized that the current system, a chaotic cowboy capitalism dominated by independent tycoons like Astor, was unsustainable for the kind of streamlined global control he envisioned. He wanted order. He wanted a central system where money could be printed and interest rates controlled from a single table. But men like Astor, Strauss, and Guggenheim represented the old guard. They were the hard money men, suspicious of fiat currency and federal overreach. They liked the chaos because they knew how to navigate it. To the architects of the Federal Reserve, these men weren't just rivals, they were dinosaurs standing in the path of a financial meteor. This economic warfare was playing out against the backdrop of a ferocious maritime race. We often think of the Titanic as a singular masterpiece, but she was actually a weapon in a commercial war. The British White Star Line, owned by Morgan's massive trust, the International Mercantile Marine Company, IMMC, was bleeding dominance. Their German rivals, the Hamburg-America Line, were building ships that were faster and more efficient. And closer to home, the British Cunard Line had launched the Lusitania and the Mauretania, speed demons that were snatching up the lucrative transatlantic passenger trade. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of White Star, was a man who, as we've heard, couldn't stand being second best. If he couldn't beat them on speed, he would crush them with size and opulence. And so the Olympic-class liners were born: Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic. They were designed to be big, monumentally, ridiculously big. But more importantly for our investigation, they were designed within a regulatory framework that was criminally outdated. This is the smoking gun of the context: the British Board of Trade Regulations. The rulebook for safety equipment hadn't been updated since 1894. In those 18 years, ships had quadrupled in size. Yet the law still calculated lifeboat requirements based on the ship's tonnage, not the number of human souls on board. The regulations assumed that a ship of Titanic's size would be its own lifeboat, that modern watertight compartments would keep it afloat long enough for a rescue ship to simply ferry passengers back and forth. This regulatory blindness wasn't a secret, it was industry standard, and for a calculated mind like Morgan's, it was a loophole large enough to sail a tragedy through. He knew the ship carried lifeboats for only about a third of its total capacity. He knew this was perfectly legal. If one wished to eliminate enemies without leaving a trace, one didn't need to break the law. One simply needed to rely on a law that was already broken. The lack of lifeboats wasn't an oversight in the plan, it was the mechanism of the murder. It ensured that if the ship went down, death was not a possibility, but a statistical certainty for the men who followed the rules of chivalry. The social structure of 1912 provided the final layer of camouflage. It was a world of rigid hierarchy, where the movements of the wealthy were insulated from the common man. The separation between first class and the lower decks was physical, legal, and spiritual. This segregation meant that the targets, Astor, Strauss, Guggenheim, were isolated in their luxury. They were in a specific part of the ship, attended by specific stewards, eating in specific rooms. Controlling their environment was easy because they lived in a golden bubble. And let's not forget the wireless. In 1912, radio was the internet of its day, a chaotic, unregulated frontier. It was a novelty for the rich to send frivolous messages home, having a lovely time past the caviar, clogging the airwaves and drowning out critical operational data like ice warnings. The wireless operators weren't even White Star employees. They worked for the Marconi Company, another entity with deep ties to the financial establishment. The flow of information was entirely in corporate hands. So picture the stage as it was set. You have a massive ship built on hubris, sailing into an ocean of ice, carrying the wealthiest obstructionists to a new banking order. You have a regulatory system that guarantees mass casualties in the event of a sinking. You have a crew under pressure to perform, a captain planning his retirement, and an owner who conveniently decided to stay home. The Edwardian era was not just a time of beautiful clothes and polite manners. It was a time of ruthless ambition, masked by etiquette. It was a world where a handshake could seal a deal, and a cancelled ticket could seal a death warrant. The Titanic didn't just sail into an iceberg. She sailed into a perfect storm of economic necessity, regulatory negligence, and corporate warfare. And in the shadows of the promenade deck, the context was closing in like the freezing dark water. To fully grasp the mechanics of this alleged conspiracy, we must look into the eyes of the players involved. A crime of this magnitude is not committed by faceless institutions. It is committed by men with pulses, egos, fears, and vendettas. On the decks of the Titanic, the cast of characters for this tragedy was assembled with the precision of a Renaissance painting, each figure representing a pillar of the world that was about to collapse. At the top of the pyramid, casting a shadow that stretched from Wall Street to Southampton, sits the antagonist who isn't there, John Pierpont Morgan. In 1912, J.P. Morgan was more than a banker. He was the unofficial emperor of the American economy. With his imposing physical presence, the fierce dark eyes that could reportedly intimidate a man into silence without a word, and the bulbous purple nose that he defied portrait painters to correct, Morgan was a force of nature. He was a man who believed in order above all else. He had single-handedly saved the U.S. Treasury twice, and he had grown tired of the chaos of the free market. He wanted a centralized banking system, a Federal Reserve that would standardize the flow of capital, and he wanted it under the control of his own banking trust. He was a man who moved nations like chess pieces, and the Titanic was his personal rook. His absence from the ship is the silence that screams the loudest. Standing directly in his path was Colonel John Jacob Astor IV. If Morgan was the emperor of banking, Astor was the king of real estate. He was the wealthiest passenger aboard, with a fortune estimated at $87 million in 1912, roughly $2.6 billion today. But Astor was more than a ledger of assets. He was a symbol of the old landed aristocracy. Tall, handsome in a somewhat detached way, and an inventor of turbine engines and bicycle brakes, Astor was a man who believed his wealth made him invulnerable. He had recently scandalized New York society by divorcing his wife and marrying Madeline Force, a girl of 18, younger than his own son. The Titanic was meant to be his triumphant return to America after waiting out the gossip in Egypt and Paris. He was a staunch opponent of the central bank concept, believing it to be a tool for market manipulation that would erode the value of tangible assets like land. He was the whale that the Federal Reserve architects needed to harpoon. Beside him in the crosshairs stood Isidor Straus. If Astor was the wallet of the opposition, Straus was its conscience. As the co-owner of Macy's department store and a former congressman, Straus was a beloved figure, a Bavarian immigrant who had built an empire on hard work and integrity. He was a man of deep principle, known for his philanthropy and his unwavering devotion to his wife Ida. Politically, Straus was a hard money advocate. He distrusted the credit expansion schemes that a central bank would facilitate. He was not a man who could be bought or bullied. His opposition to the Federal Reserve was rooted in a lifetime of fiscal prudence. He was traveling back from a winter in Europe, looking forward to a quiet retirement, unaware that his moral stance had placed him on a death list. The third target was Benjamin Guggenheim. The heir to a massive mining fortune, Guggenheim was the wild card of the trio. He was flamboyant, often estranged from his wife, and traveling on the Titanic with his French mistress, Madame Aubard. While he was less politically active than Strauss, his financial independence was a threat. The Guggenheim family controlled vast resources of copper and silver, commodities that would be directly impacted by the currency manipulation of a central bank. He was a man who lived loudly and without apology. In the eyes of the conspirators, he represented the unpredictable, uncontrollable nature of independent wealth, the very thing the Federal Reserve was designed to tame. Then, we have the pawns, or perhaps the accomplices. Joseph Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, was a man living in Morgan's shadow. Tall, with a heavy mustache and a nervous, domineering energy, Ismay was desperate to prove that he was not just a Nepo baby who had inherited his father's shipping line. He had sold the White Star Line to Morgan's Trust in 1902, making him technically an employee of the American banking giant. Ismay was the one who reportedly pressured the captain to increase speed, to make headlines, to beat the arrival time of their sister ship, the Olympic. Was he acting on his own ego? Or was he following a directive from his boss in New York to ensure the ship was pushed into danger? Ismay's survival, escaping in a lifeboat while his passengers died, would later brand him as the coward of the Titanic, but perhaps his true crime was compliance, not cowardice. And finally, Captain Edward John Smith, the millionaire's captain. At 62, with a white beard that made him look like a maritime Santa Claus, Smith was the most respected commander on the North Atlantic. Wealthy passengers specifically adjusted their travel schedules to sail with him. This was to be his final voyage before retirement, his swan song. He was known for a relaxed style of command, often dining with passengers and leaving the bridge to his officers. But Smith was also a company man through and through. He had served the White Star Line for decades. If orders came down to maintain speed, to ignore ice, to arrive early, would he have defied them? Or would he have trusted the unsinkable ship and the corporate mandate over his own instincts? Smith is the tragic figure, the man whose loyalty may have been weaponized against him. These men were not merely names on a manifest. They were flesh and blood, eating in the same dining saloon, walking the same decks. Astor, with his pregnant wife, worrying about the scandal awaiting him in New York. Strauss holding Ida's hand, thinking of their children. Guggenheim dressing for dinner, enjoying the finest luxury money could buy. Ismay watching the speedometer with a nervous tick. Smith looking at the stars and thinking of retirement. They moved around each other in the first-class smoker, the Palm Court, and the Turkish baths, likely nodding in polite recognition, unaware that they were trapped in a narrative that had already been written. The tension between them was not visible. It was buried under layers of Edwardian etiquette and cigar smoke. But the dynamic was clear. The independent kings of the old world were sailing on a ship built by the emperor of the new one, and only one side held the keys to the lifeboats. As the ship steamed westward, the psychological profiles of these men became the gears of the disaster. The conspirators counted on Astor's arrogance to keep him on the ship until it was too late. They counted on Strauss's honor to keep him from taking a seat in a boat. They counted on Smith's complacency to drive them into the ice. The crime required these specific men to be exactly who they were. It was a plot built not just on mechanics, but on character. And as the nights grew colder and the conversations in the smoking room turned to business and politics, the trap was closing around them, powered by their own personalities. To appreciate the cruelty of the trap, we must witness the comfort of the cage. Sunday, April 14th, 1912, did not dawn with the ominous gray of a funeral. It arrived with the brilliant, blinding blue of a perfect spring morning. On the decks of the Titanic, the world felt suspended in a state of grace. The Atlantic, usually a roiling beast of gray waves and white foam, had smoothed itself into a sheet of undulating glass, reflecting the sunlight with such intensity that passengers on the boat deck had to squint against the glare. It was, by all accounts, the kind of day that makes human beings feel immortal. Inside the ship, the atmosphere was one of drowsy, opulent Sunday leisure. The silence of the ocean was held at bay by the constant, reassuring thrum of the reciprocating engines, a heartbeat of steel and coal that vibrated gently through the soles of everyone's shoes, a reminder that they were conquering the void at 22 knots. In the first-class dining saloon, a room so vast and panelled in Jacobean oak that it felt more like a manor house than a ship, the day began with a religious service. Captain Smith, the patriarch of this floating city, led the congregation in prayer. There is a profound irony in imagining John Jacob Astor and Isidor Straus standing there, heads bowed, listening to the captain read from the prayer book about preservation from the dangers of the sea. They were praying for safety to a man who, knowingly or not, was driving them toward the only thing in the North Atlantic that could kill them. As the day wore on, the ship transformed into a hive of high society rituals. The targets of our conspiracy were visible, relaxed, and utterly disarmed by the luxury surrounding them. Colonel Astor was seen strolling on the A-deck promenade with his young wife, Madeleine. Witnesses described him as looking content, perhaps even relieved to be away from the prying eyes of the New York press. He was wearing a heavy coat against the crisp air, walking with the confident stride of a man who owned a significant percentage of Manhattan. He stopped to show Madeleine the mechanical horses in the gymnasium, marveling at the electric camels, toys for the wealthy, designed to simulate riding without the inconvenience of the outdoors. Benjamin Guggenheim, meanwhile, was enjoying the more hedonistic side of the trap. He spent his afternoon in the a la carte restaurant, a venue managed by Luigi Gatti, which operated independently of the White Star Line's main kitchens. Here, passengers could order whatever they desired, regardless of the menu. Guggenheim, the mining heir who refused to be constrained by rules, was in his element. He was surrounded by the finest French service, drinking vintage wine, perhaps discussing the very mining interests that the new banking laws would soon complicate. He was a man who lived for the tangible pleasures of the moment, unaware that his time was being measured in hours. But it is in the hidden corners of the ship where the crime was truly being facilitated. While the passengers drank tea and listened to the ship's orchestra play selections from The Tales of Hoffmann, the wireless room was drowning. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, the Marconi operators, were buried under a mountain of passenger messages. The equipment had broken down the night before and had only just been fixed, creating a backlog. This backlog was a convenient fog. Vital ice warnings, messages from other ships like the Baltic and the Caronia warning of massive field ice, were received, scribbled down, and often set aside in favor of sending stock updates and greeting cards for the wealthy. Was this merely incompetence? Or was the system designed to be overwhelmed, ensuring that the most critical data never reached the bridge with the urgency it required? As evening approached, nature provided a spectacular curtain raiser for the tragedy. The sunset on April 14th was described by survivors as one of the most beautiful they had ever seen, a riot of purple, orange, and bruised red stretching across the western horizon. But as the sun dipped below the curve of the Earth, the temperature didn't just fall, it plummeted. In the span of a few hours, the air went from a brisk spring chill to a freezing bite. This was the thermal signature of a massive ice field, a warning sign that any experienced sailor should have recognized instantly. Yet, inside the ship, the illusion of warmth and safety was aggressively maintained. The lights of the Titanic blazed against the sudden darkness, a defiant galaxy in the middle of a black universe. The final dinner aboard the Titanic was the centerpiece of the evening, a ritual of consumption that bordered on the grotesque given what was to come. In the first-class dining saloon, the tables were set with heavy silver and fine crystal. The menu was a testament to the Edwardian obsession with excess. Oysters, consommé Olga, poached salmon with mousseline sauce, filet mignon lily, roast duckling, punch romaine, roast squab and cress, cold asparagus vinaigrette, pâte de foie gras, and Waldorf pudding. At a special table in the a la carte restaurant, a private dinner party was being held in honor of Captain Smith. The hosts were the Widener family, wealthy Philadelphians who had made their fortune in streetcars, another industry threatened by centralized banking regulation. The guest list was a who's who of the doomed. They drank champagne and toasted the captain's retirement. Smith, the man responsible for the lives of 200 people, spent his evening socializing, smoking cigars and drinking wine, far away from the bridge where the temperature was dropping toward freezing. One can imagine the conversation at that table. It likely touched on the coal strike in England, the suffragette movement, and almost certainly the looming battle over the Federal Reserve. These men were consistent in their views. They would have reinforced each other's resolve to fight the legislation once they returned to Washington and New York. They sat there, breaking bread, feeling the gentle vibration of the floor, unaware that the speed of that vibration was the very weapon being used against them. After dinner, the gender segregation of the era moved the men to the smoking room on A deck. This room was the inner sanctum of the target demographic. Dark mahogany paneling, mother-of-pearl inlays, leather armchairs, and stained glass windows depicting maritime scenes. The air was thick with the smoke of expensive Havanas. Here, Astor, Strauss, and the other power brokers gathered for a final nightcap. It is a haunting image. The architects of the opposition gathered in one room, suspended over the abyss. They played cards, bridge, and whist. They discussed the speed of the ship, noting with approval that they were making excellent time. They were complicit in their own hurry, driven by the American need for speed and efficiency. The conspiracy didn't need to force them to be reckless. It only needed to encourage the culture of speed they had helped create. Meanwhile, deep below the waterline, in the hellish heat of Boiler Room 6, the black gang of the stokers were shoveling coal into the furnaces at a furious pace. They were the engine of the crime, sweating and cursing, feeding the fires that kept the propellers turning at 75 revolutions per minute. They knew nothing of Federal Reserves or banking trusts. They only knew that the order from above was to keep the pressure high, to keep the ship moving, to drive the Leviathan forward. As 11:00 p.m. approached, the ship quieted down. The stewards began to dim the lights in the corridors. The orchestra finished their set and packed away their instruments. Passengers drifted to their staterooms, lulled by the rhythm of the engines. Astor kissed his wife goodnight. Strauss tucked Ida into bed. Guggenheim retired to his suite. The trap was now fully primed. The ship was racing at 22. 5 knots through a moonless night, entering a zone known to be infested with ice, with the lookouts deprived of binoculars and the wireless operators distracted by trivia. The luxury had done its job. It had lulled the targets into a state of total, fatal complacency. The champagne had been drunk, the cigars smoked, the politics debated. Now the ocean was ready to claim its due. The golden cage was locked, and the key was about to be thrown away. To detect a conspiracy, one must look for the accumulation of bad luck. A single mechanical failure is an accident, 2 is a coincidence, 3 is a pattern. But on the Titanic, the errors didn't just stack up. They interlocked with the precision of a combination lock clicking into place. As Sunday evening deepened and the cold air settled over the Atlantic like a shroud, the ship began to exhibit signs of distress that were invisible to the passengers sipping punch in the lounge, but glaringly obvious to anyone paying attention to the machinery of the voyage. The first sign of danger had actually been burning for days, hidden deep in the ship's belly. It was a fire, specifically a coal fire in Boiler Room 6. This is a documented fact often left out of the romanticized retellings. Before the ship even left Southampton, a fire had ignited in one of the massive coal bunkers. Spontaneous combustion in coal piles was a known risk, but this was no small smolder. It raged at temperatures capable of warping steel, turning the bulkhead, the wall separating the coal from the rest of the ship, into a glowing, weakened sheet of metal. In a normal investigation, this fire would be a red flag for negligence, but in a murder investigation, it looks like a tactical advantage. The fire forced the stokers to work at a frantic pace, shoveling coal from the burning bunker into the furnaces to stop the fire from spreading. This necessity conveniently aligned with the corporate desire for speed. The ship had to burn coal faster than usual to control the fire, which meant the ship had to move faster than was safe. It provided a perfect operational cover for the reckless speed that was driving them toward the ice. And terrifyingly, the fire weakened the hull in the exact same section where the iceberg would later tear the ship open. Was it a sabotage designed to compromise the ship's structural integrity, or just a convenient disaster that the conspirators exploited? Higher up on the ship, another piece of safety equipment vanished under suspicious circumstances. This involves a man named David Blair. Blair was originally assigned to be the Titanic's second officer, But in a last-minute reshuffle just before departure, he was bumped from the crew roster to make room for Henry Wilde, a senior officer brought over from the Olympic. In his haste to leave the ship, or perhaps with deliberate intent, Blair took something with him, the key to the storage locker in the crow's nest. Inside that locker were the binoculars for the lookouts. When Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee climbed into the crow's nest for their watch on that freezing night, they were blind. They had asked for the binoculars, but were told they were unavailable. So, on the darkest night of the voyage, moving at maximum speed into a known ice field, the eyes of the ship were forced to rely on naked vision. In a crime of environment, removing the binoculars is akin to cutting the brake lines on a car. It doesn't guarantee a crash, but it makes avoiding one nearly impossible. The key, a small piece of brass no larger than a finger, became one of the most lethal weapons in the conspiracy's arsenal. Then came the silence of the radio. The wireless room was the nerve center of the ship, the only link to the outside world. But on April 14th, it became a bottleneck of fatal emissions. Throughout the day, other ships in the corridor had been screaming warnings. The Caronia, the Baltic, the America, and the Nordam all sent messages detailing heavy pack ice and massive bergs. These were not vague advisories. They were specific coordinates that placed a wall of ice directly across Titanic's path. The most damning failure occurred at 9:40 p.m. A ship called the Mesaba sent a message that was unequivocal. Saw much heavy pack ice and great number large icebergs, also field ice. The coordinates provided by the Mesaba placed this ice field squarely in front of the Titanic. This message was the smoking gun. If it had reached the bridge, Captain Smith would have been forced to slow down or change course. It was a warning that transformed the ice from a possibility into a certainty, but the message never reached the bridge. Jack Phillips, the senior wireless operator, was exhausted. He was frantically working through the backlog of commercial messages, birthday wishes, and stock trades for the wealthy passengers. When the Mesaba warning came in, it wasn't marked with the specific prefix MSG, Master Service Gram, that required personal delivery to the captain. So, Phillips, overwhelmed and perhaps prioritizing the revenue-generating messages of the passengers over the safety of the ship, shoved the warning under a paperweight. He literally filed the death warrant of the ship under a pile of trivia. In the context of a conspiracy, one has to ask, was the breakdown of the wireless equipment the day before a genuine malfunction, or was it a convenient way to create a backlog that would justify ignoring operational warnings? The final and perhaps most chilling omen was the behavior of the SS Californian. This small freighter had stopped for the night about 10 to 19 miles away from the Titanic. Its captain, Stanley Lord, had seen the ice field and wisely decided to halt until morning. At 10:55 p.m., the Californian's wireless operator, Cyril Evans, tried to warn the Titanic one last time. He tapped out, "Say, old man, we are stopped and surrounded by ice." The signal blasted into Jack Phillips's headset, deafening him because the ships were so close. Annoyed by the interruption to his work, Phillips snapped back with the now infamous reply, "Shut up! Shut up! I am busy! I am working Cape Race." Insulted and tired, Evans turned off his radio and went to bed. This interaction is the hinge upon which the tragedy swings, but viewed through a criminal lens, the presence of the Californian is deeply suspicious. Why was she there? Some theories suggest she wasn't just a random freighter, but a designated rescue ship, or perhaps a witness ship, positioned by the same interests that controlled the White Star Line. The theory goes that the Californian was supposed to pick up the survivors, specifically the high-value targets, once the Titanic was disabled, but they miscalculated the distance or the ice or the speed of the sinking. Captain Lord's strange behavior that night, seeing rockets and lights but refusing to wake his wireless operator or move his ship, has baffled historians for a century. Was he a confused mariner or a man waiting for a specific signal that never came? Meanwhile, on the bridge of the Titanic, the silence was absolute. Captain Smith had retired for the night, leaving instructions to be woken if the situation becomes at all doubtful. But he had not been told about the Mesaba warning. He didn't know the ice was a wall, not a scattering. He was operating on incomplete data, driving a blinded ship with a fire in its belly. The temperature outside had dropped to 31 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was so still that there were no ripples to break against the base of the icebergs, removing the white water that usually warned lookouts of danger at night. The sea was hiding its teeth. In the first-class smoking room, the card games continued. The ice in the highball glasses clinked softly, a miniature echo of the monster waiting in the dark. The vibration of the engines was constant, a reassuring tremor that told the passengers that technology was still winning. But down in the bow, the steel was cold, brittle, and unsuspecting. The trap had been stripped of its safety nets. The binoculars were gone. The warnings were silenced. The rescue ship was asleep. The hull was weakened by fire, and the targets, Astor, Strauss, Guggenheim, were exactly where they were supposed to be. At 11:39 p.m., Frederick Fleet, freezing in the crow's nest, squinted into the black haze ahead. He saw something that blotted out the stars, a shape darker than the darkness. It wasn't a shadow. It was the end of the world, waiting for them to arrive. And it was right on time. To understand the full scope of the accusation, we must move beyond the ice and the steel to the invisible architecture of the crime. The central hypothesis of this investigation does not concern navigation errors or brittle rivets. It concerns the ownership of the future. The theory, whispered in the corridors of power for over a century, is precise and devastating. The Titanic was the violent solution to a political stalemate, a mass execution disguised as a maritime accident designed to pave the way for the creation of the Federal Reserve. This is the Federal Reserve conspiracy. It is the dark heart of the Titanic mystery, the narrative that transforms the tragedy from a story of hubris into a story of a coup. To grasp why this theory holds such weight, we must look at what happened on a secluded island off the coast of Georgia just 2 years before the ship sailed. In November 1910, a private train car with the blinds drawn left New Jersey in the dead of night. Inside were some of the most powerful men in America: Senator Nelson Aldrich, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury A. Piatt Andrew, and bankers representing the interests of J.P. Morgan, the Rockefellers, and the Rothschilds. They traveled to the exclusive Jekyll Island Club, a retreat for the ultra-wealthy, under absolute secrecy. They were instructed to use only first names to avoid detection by the press or servants. For 10 days, in the smoke-filled rooms of the club, these men drafted the legislation that would become the Federal Reserve Act. Their goal was to create a central bank, a private entity with the power to control the nation's currency, set interest rates, and effectively govern the American economy. They knew the public was fiercely opposed to a central bank, viewing it as a tool for the elite to manipulate wealth. So they crafted a plan to market it as a regional reserve system, a stabilizing force that would prevent panics like the one in 1907. But a plan drafted in secret still had to survive the light of day in Washington. And this is where the theory identifies the motive for murder. The hypothesis posits that John Jacob Astor Thorpe, Isidor Straus, and Benjamin Guggenheim were the unbribable opposition. These men represented the pinnacle of old money and independent wealth. Their fortunes were built on tangible assets, real estate, retail, and mining, not on the fluid, manipulative credit systems that the new banking order sought to control. They were men of immense personal sovereignty. They did not need loans from the Morgan Trust. They did not need the approval of the Rockefeller Empire. They were financial city-states unto themselves. The theory suggests that these three men recognized the Federal Reserve for what it was: a consolidation of power that would erode the value of their hard assets and enslave the American economy to a cartel of private bankers. With their combined wealth, which exceeded the GDP of many nations, and their vast political influence, they had the power to block the legislation. They could fund opposition campaigns, lobby Congress, and turn public opinion against the money trust. As long as they stood in the way, the Federal Reserve Act was dead on arrival. So, the theory argues, they had to be removed. The proponents of this theory point to the staggering coincidence of the timeline. The Titanic sinks in April 1912, taking Astor, Strauss, and Guggenheim to the bottom. With the opposition decapitated, the political landscape shifted. The resistance to the central bank concept lost its most powerful financiers. In the ensuing months, the legislative roadblocks began to crumble. On December 23, 1913, just 20 months after the Titanic went down, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law. The money trust had won. The timing, skeptics argue, is too perfect to be accidental. This hypothesis also offers a chilling explanation for J.P. Morgan's behavior. As the owner of the White Star Line and the primary beneficiary of the Federal Reserve System, Morgan had the means, the motive, and the opportunity. His last-minute cancellation wasn't a whim, it was the final step in the plan. He knew the ship was a death trap. He knew the lifeboats were insufficient. He knew the captain would be pressured to speed. By removing himself and his cargo, he was ensuring his own survival while sending his enemies into a calculated kill zone. Critics and mainstream historians, of course, reject this theory. They argue that there is no direct evidence that Astor, Strauss, or Guggenheim were actively campaigning against the Federal Reserve. They point out that Strauss, in particular, had supported some banking reform in the past. They argue that the opposition is a projection of modern anti-Federal Reserve sentiment onto historical figures. They claim that Morgan would never destroy his own flagship, a massive financial asset, just to kill 3 men. They view the sinking as exactly what the inquiry said it was, a tragedy of errors. But the defense of the theory is rooted in the silence. The conspirators wouldn't need a public campaign from Astor to know he was a threat. They would know his private mind. In the small incestuous world of the 1912 elite, everyone knew everyone's business. If Astor had whispered his intent to block the bill over brandy at the Knickerbocker Club, that would have been enough to seal his fate. Furthermore, the destruction of the asset argument is countered by the insurance claim. The Titanic was fully insured, and her loss, while tragic, was financially recoverable for the International Mercantile Marine Company. In fact, some darker variations of the theory suggest the ship was already a financial liability, a white elephant that was more valuable at the bottom of the ocean than sailing empty during the brewing coal strikes. The theory creates a narrative where the iceberg was merely the weapon, not the cause. It suggests that the accident was a probability that was managed and exploited. If the ship didn't hit ice, perhaps something else would have happened. But the ice was the preferred method, clean, natural, and blameless. This perspective recasts every detail of the voyage. The lack of binoculars becomes a blinding measure. The ignored wireless messages become a suppression of intelligence. The speed becomes a forced march into an ambush. The women and children first protocol becomes a mechanism to ensure the targets. Honorable men who would follow the rules stayed on the ship, while the conspirators' agents, like Ismay, might find a way off. It is a terrifying hypothesis because it suggests that the modern economic world was born in blood, that the Federal Reserve, the institution that today controls the global flow of money, stands on a foundation laid by the drowning of its enemies. It implies that the Titanic is not a story of the past, but the origin story of the present. As we move deeper into the investigation, we must treat this theory not as a proven fact, but as the lens through which we examine the evidence. Does the behavior of the crew support a conspiracy? Do the inquiries show signs of a cover-up? Or was it truly just the chaotic, unpredictable cruelty of the sea? The pieces are on the board. The motives are clear. The timeline is damning. But to prove a crime of this magnitude, we need more than motive. We need the smoking gun of the event itself. We need to look at what happened when the order was given to abandon ship and why the rescue that should have been possible, the Californians sitting just miles away, never came. Was the horizon empty by accident, or was the ocean cleared to ensure that when the targets went into the water, they stayed there? The theory is the shadow that walks beside the history, and as the Titanic raced toward midnight, that shadow was about to swallow them all. To solve a murder, you must walk through the minute-by-minute choreography of the death. You must stand where the victim stood and see what they saw. On the night of April 14, 1912, the timeline of the Titanic is not just a sequence of bad luck. It is a mechanical script executing a fatal command. If we view the ship as a weapon aimed at the financial sovereignty of Astor, Strauss, and Guggenheim, then the events between 11:30 p.m. and midnight act as the pulling of the trigger. At 11:30 p.m., the Titanic was a capsule of light suspended in an infinite void. The temperature on deck had bottomed out at 31 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a cold so sharp it felt like inhaling glass. Most of the 200 people on board were asleep, lulled by the hypnotic, rhythmic vibration of the engines running at near maximum capacity. But inside the first-class smoking room, the targets were still awake. The air was thick with the rich scent of expensive tobacco and the low murmur of conversation. Colonel Astor was likely finishing a final cigarette. Benjamin Guggenheim was perhaps ordering a nightcap. They were warm, comfortable, and completely insulated from the reality that, just a few hundred feet away, the Atlantic Ocean was preparing to murder them. High above them, in the crow's nest, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee were shivering. They were wrapping their scarves tight against the biting wind created by the ship's speed, 22. 5 knots through a pitch-black night. Without binoculars, their eyes were straining, tearing up in the cold wind, trying to separate the black of the sky from the black of the water. They were the first victims of the conspiracy's negligence. They had been blinded by a missing key, a detail that feels less like an oversight and more like a tactical blinding. On the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch stood watch. He was a good seaman, respected and experienced. But he was also a man under immense pressure. The standing orders were clear: maintain course and speed. The company man directive, pushed by Ismay, was to make New York by Tuesday night. Murdoch knew the ice warnings were piling up. He knew the air temperature indicated ice. He knew the water was dead calm, hiding the breakers. Yet the telegraph to the engine room remained set to full ahead. In a criminal reconstruction, this is the moment of complicity. A competent officer in these conditions slows down. A coerced officer, or one driven by a corporate culture of invincibility, keeps the throttle open. The ship was flying blind into a wall, and nobody lifted a hand to the brake. At 11:40 p.m., the illusion broke. Fleet saw it first, a black mass blocking out the stars. He rang the bell 3 times, clang, clang, clang. The sound was small, tinny against the vastness of the ocean, but it was the death knell of the Edwardian era. He grabbed the telephone to the bridge. "Iceberg, right ahead." On the bridge, Murdoch had 37 seconds to react. This half-minute is the most debated sequence in maritime history. His orders were hard a starboard to turn the ship to the left and full astern to reverse engines. It was a standard evasive maneuver. But in the context of the conspiracy, the result was suspiciously perfect. If the Titanic had hit the iceberg head-on, the damage would have been brutal. The bow would have crushed like an accordion. Men in the forward quarters would have died instantly. But the ship, designed with transverse bulkheads, would likely have survived. She would have bobbed there, a broken nose in the water, waiting for rescue. Astor, Strauss, and Guggenheim would have been inconvenienced, but alive. Instead, Murdoch's maneuver exposed the ship's vulnerable flank. The Titanic didn't smash into the ice, she glided past it. It was a glancing blow, a phrase that sounds gentle but was actually surgical. The underwater spur of the iceberg acted like a can opener, slicing open the rivets along the starboard side for 300 feet. It opened the forepeak, the number 1 hold, number 2, number 3, number 6 boiler room. It was a wound that bypassed the ship's safety design with mathematical precision. The ship could float with 4 compartments flooded. The ice opened 5. It was the golden shot, the only type of collision that guaranteed a total loss. Was it just bad luck that the ship turned exactly enough to doom itself but not enough to miss? Or was the high speed maintained until the last second the variable that ensured the turn would be too wide, too slow, and ultimately fatal? The impact itself was underwhelming. To the passengers, it felt like a long scraping sound, or as if the ship had rolled over 1,000 marbles. In the smoking room, the vibration rattled the drinks on the table. Astor looked up, perhaps annoyed by the spill. He didn't know that the sound he just heard was the sound of his own execution. He walked out onto the deck to investigate, saw some ice shavings on the well deck, and reportedly dismissed it as nothing serious. "We've struck ice," he told a friend later, "but there is no danger." The conspiracy relied on this exact reaction, the belief that the ship was safer than the lifeboats. Below the waterline, the reality was horrific. Thousands of tons of seawater were jetting into the hull at the pressure of a fire hose. The Black Gang in Boiler Room 6 saw the side of the ship buckle and water explode inward. They scrambled up the escape ladders just seconds before the room was swallowed. The ship's lifeblood, its buoyancy, was bleeding out. Captain Smith rushed to the bridge. "What have we struck?" he asked. Murdoch replied, "An iceberg, sir." The two men, along with Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, began their inspection. This is where the reconstruction turns chilling. Within 20 minutes, by midnight, Andrews knew. He did the math on a notepad. 5 compartments. The ship was a mathematical corpse. She had an hour, maybe 2, to live. Smith knew it too. And here lies the darkest question of the night. Knowing the ship was doomed, knowing there were lifeboats for only half the people, knowing his most prominent passengers were the wealthiest men in America, what did he do? He didn't sound the general alarm. He didn't scream over the tannoy. There was no siren. The order to uncover the lifeboats was given quietly. The stewards were told to wake passengers gently, to tell them it was a precautionary measure. Why? The standard answer is to prevent panic. Panic kills. But in our investigation, preventing panic looks a lot like controlling the exit. By keeping the atmosphere calm, the crew ensured that the early lifeboats left half empty. Who benefits from half-empty boats? Not the passengers. But if the goal is to ensure that specific men of honor who would wait for the women and children call, stayed on board, then a calm, orderly, slow evacuation was the perfect weapon. If there had been a mad rush, Astor might have fought for a seat to protect his pregnant wife. If there had been chaos, Guggenheim might have bribed his way onto a boat. But in the polite, quiet, orderly nightmare that Smith orchestrated, these men stood back. They waited. They played their parts as gentlemen. At 12:00 a.m., the Titanic was dead in the water, blowing off steam with a deafening roar that made conversation on deck difficult, the death rattle of the boilers. The wireless operators, Phillips and Bride, began tapping out CQD, the distress call. But even this feels managed. The Californian was close, but her radio was dead. The Carpathia was 4 hours away, too far to save the ship, but close enough to pick up the survivors who were allowed to live. As the clock ticked past midnight, the separation began. The women were herded toward the boats. The men were held back by officers with revolvers and a rigid adherence to social code. The trap had snapped shut. The water was rising in the squash court, drowning the mailroom, creeping up the stairs, and in the first-class lounge the band began to play ragtime. Upbeat, cheerful music, the soundtrack to a murder. It kept the pulse rates down. It kept the crowd docile. It kept the targets on the deck, waiting for a rescue that the cold mathematics of the Atlantic had already decided would never come. Every perfectly constructed crime has a flaw, a loose thread, a moment where the carefully orchestrated reality glitches, revealing the machinery operating behind the curtain. In the investigation of the Titanic, this moment of discontinuity, the detail that simply does not fit the narrative of a tragic accident, arrives in the form of a light on the horizon. At 12:45 a.m., the situation on the Titanic was shifting from concern to terror. The forward well deck was awash. The list to starboard was becoming noticeable. The first lifeboat, number 7, had just been lowered into the darkness, carrying a fraction of its capacity. But on the bridge, 4th Officer Joseph Boxhall was not looking at the water. He was looking at the sky. Through his binoculars he spotted a light, not a star, not a reflection, but the distinct, steady masthead light of another steamer. It was close, agonizingly close. Estimates placed it between 5 and 10 miles away. It was so near that Boxhall could see its red and green navigation lights clearly with the naked eye. This wasn't a ghost. It was a ship. It was the difference between life and death for 1,500 people. Captain Smith, desperate for salvation, ordered Boxhall to signal the vessel. Boxhall grabbed the Morse lamp, a powerful shuttered light used for silent communication, and began frantically tapping out the universal call for help. ... .. He signaled until his arm ached. He paused, watching for a reply. The other ship seemed to flicker, as if acknowledging, but no message came back. Then Smith ordered the rockets. The Titanic was equipped with distress rockets that fired 800 feet into the air and exploded in a shower of brilliant white stars. These were not fireworks for a party. In the maritime language of 1912, a rocket fired at sea meant only one thing. I am in distress. I require immediate assistance. Boxhall fired the first one at 12:45 a.m. The boom echoed across the calm water, a thunderclap in the silence. The flash illuminated the pale faces of the passengers on the boat deck, momentarily turning the night into day. He fired 8 rockets in total, one every 5 or 6 minutes. Each one was a scream for help written in gunpowder, and the ship on the horizon saw them. This is the discontinuity. This is the moment where the logic of an accident breaks down and the shadow of a conspiracy becomes impossible to ignore. We know today that the ship was the SS Californian, a small Leyland Line freighter under the command of Captain Stanley Lord. We know it was stopped in the ice field waiting for daylight, and we know from the sworn testimony of its own crew that they watched the Titanic die. On the deck of the Californian, Second Officer Herbert Stone and apprentice James Gibson were on watch. They saw the lights of a large steamer to the south. They watched it stop, and then they watched it fire rockets. "That ship is firing rockets," Stone told Gibson. They counted them, 5, 6, 7. They discussed what the rockets meant. Stone remarked that a ship doesn't fire rockets at sea for no reason. He even said, "She looks very queer out of the water, her lights look queer." He noticed that the ship seemed to be listing, that her lights were disappearing, as if she were shutting down or sinking. Stone did exactly what an officer is supposed to do. He went down to the chart room and woke Captain Lord. "The ship is firing rockets, sir," Stone reported. And here lies the inexplicable, maddening gap in the story. Captain Lord, a man with a reputation for strict discipline, a man who had stopped his own ship to ensure safety, did nothing. He didn't come to the deck. He didn't order the wireless operator Cyril Evans to wake up and turn on his set. He didn't order the engines to be fired up. He simply asked if the rockets were company signals, colored flares used by shipping lines to identify themselves to passing vessels. Stone replied that they were white rockets. In the ambiguity of 1912 regulations, white rockets could be interpreted as signals, but multiple white rockets fired at intervals were universally understood as distress. Lord mumbled something about Morse lamping her again and went back to sleep. Let that sink in. A captain is told a nearby ship is firing rockets in a dangerous ice field, and he goes back to sleep. It is behavior so fundamentally opposed to the code of the sea that it defies psychological explanation, unless the explanation is that he was expecting something. The conspiracy theory posits that the Californian was not there by accident. It suggests that Captain Lord had been instructed to be at that specific location. But what was his role? Was he the designated rescue vessel, positioned to pick up the survivors after the accident had been successfully executed? If so, why didn't he move? The darker interpretation is that the Californian was the witness ship. Its job was to verify the sinking, to ensure the job was done, but not to intervene until the targets, Astor, Strauss, Guggenheim, were confirmed dead. If the Californian had raced to the scene at 12:45 a.m., she would have arrived by 1:30 a.m., well before the Titanic went under. She could have pulled alongside. She could have saved everyone. If the plan was to eliminate specific men, a premature rescue would have ruined everything. The targets would have walked off the Titanic onto the Californian, wet but alive, and the Federal Reserve plot would have failed. So Captain Lord sat there. He held his position. He watched the rockets arc into the sky, knowing that each one represented a desperate plea from the dying ship. He effectively ran out the clock. But there is an even stranger layer to this discontinuity. Some witnesses on the Titanic insisted that the light they saw was not the Californian, but a third ship, a mystery ship that was between them. They claimed this vessel approached to within 5 miles, saw the sinking, and then turned around and steamed away into the dark. This third ship has been identified by some researchers as the Samson, a Norwegian sealer fishing illegally in the area. If true, the Samson fled to avoid arrest, inadvertently leaving 1,500 people to die. However, the Californian remains the primary suspect in the crime. The timeline of her inaction aligns too perfectly with the needs of the conspiracy. At 2:20 a.m., the lights of the Titanic finally vanished. Stone and Gibson on the Californian watched them disappear. "She's gone," one of them said. Only then, as dawn broke and the Carpathia, a ship not part of the plan, appeared on the scene, did Captain Lord suddenly wake up. He turned on his wireless, discovered the tragedy, and drove his ship through the ice field to the site. But he was too late. The water was empty, except for wreckage and bodies. When the Californian arrived at the scene, she didn't pick up a single survivor. The Carpathia had done the work. Lord's behavior later during the inquiries was defensive, contradictory, and evasive. He was a man who looked like he was hiding a secret that terrified him more than public shame. He was branded a pariah, the man who let the Titanic sink, but he never cracked. He never explained why. This is the discontinuity that haunts the case, a ship that sees a murder and turns its back, a captain who sleeps through the apocalypse. It is the moment where the mask of negligence slips and the cold, unblinking eye of complicity stares back. The Californian was the getaway driver who froze, the accomplice who watched the house burn down to ensure no one made it out the back door. And as the screams drifted across the water, fading into silence, the only thing louder than the dying was the quiet of the ship that watched them die. History is not recorded. It is curated. In the aftermath of a crime, the most dangerous evidence is not the weapon, but the memory. As the Carpathia steamed toward New York with its cargo of traumatized survivors, the process of editing the truth began before the ship even docked. The witnesses to the sinking of the Titanic held in their minds 1,000 different fragments of the night, but the official narrative required a single, streamlined story: an accident, a heroic crew, and a tragic but unavoidable loss of life. To maintain the cover-up of a calculated elimination, the voices that whispered otherwise had to be silenced, discredited, or ignored. The British Wreck Commissioner's inquiry, held in London under Lord Mersey, became the primary mechanism for this censorship. Lord Mersey was a man of the Empire, tasked with protecting the reputation of the British Merchant Marine and, by extension, the financial interests of the White Star Line. The testimony given in that wood-paneled room was a masterclass in evasion. Second Officer Charles Lightoller was the highest-ranking surviving officer and the star witness. He was a man of immense courage, having survived by clinging to an overturned collapsible boat, but he was also a company man to his core. His testimony was a fortress of denial. When asked about the ship's speed, he insisted it was safe. When asked about the ice warnings, he claimed they were standard. When asked about the loading of the lifeboats, he defended the women and children only policy that he had enforced with ruthless strictness, a policy that conveniently ensured the male targets of the conspiracy remained on board. Lightoller's answers were short, clipped, and defensive. He was protecting the line, but was he also protecting a darker secret? Years later in his memoirs, he would admit to suppressing details about the steering error and the confusion on the bridge, proving that his sworn testimony was, at the very least, incomplete. But the cracks in the official story appeared in the statements of the passengers, witnesses who had no loyalty to J.P. Morgan or the White Star Line. Consider the testimony regarding the third ship. While the inquiry tried to pin everything on the Californian or dismiss the sighting as a star, survivor after survivor insisted they saw a vessel nearby. Mrs. Albert Caldwell, a second-class passenger, stated clearly, "We saw the lights of a ship. We watched it for some time." Lawrence Beasley, a science teacher, whose detailed account is considered one of the most reliable, described the crew's fixation on a light on the horizon. If this ship existed, and if it turned away as the Titanic sank, its identity remains one of the great uninvestigated leads. Was it a surveillance vessel ensuring the job was done? The inquiry didn't want to know. They aggressively steered questioning away from the identity of the mystery ship, eager to close the file. Then there are the gunshots. The official legend of the Titanic speaks of a band playing "Nearer, My God, to Thee" and a stoic captain going down with his ship. It does not like to speak of violence, but numerous witnesses, particularly from steerage and third class, testified to seeing officers fire revolvers. Eugene Daly, a steerage passenger, claimed he saw an officer shoot 2 men dead for trying to rush a boat and then turn the gun on himself. Other witnesses reported shots fired near Collapsible Sea, the very boat that Bruce Ismay used to escape. Why does this matter to the conspiracy? Because if the evacuation was not orderly, but a chaotic struggle for survival suppressed by gunfire, it suggests a ruthless enforcement of the no men rule. If an officer killed a passenger, was it crowd control? Or was it the elimination of someone who knew too much, or someone trying to break the quarantine of the targets? The rumors that First Officer Murdoch committed suicide after shooting passengers were persistent enough that his family received personal letters of denial from the White Star Line, yet the witnesses stuck to their stories. The inquiry dismissed these accounts as hysteria, wiping the violence from the record to preserve the image of a gentlemanly disaster. The most crucial silences, however, surround the targets themselves. We have very few testimonies about the final specific movements of Astor, Strauss, and Guggenheim in the last 30 minutes. We know they were on deck. We know they were calm, but we don't know what they said. Did Astor realize, as he watched the half-empty boats lower, that he was being kept on board by design? There is a haunting statement from a survivor named Colonel Archibald Gracie, who spent the final moments on deck with Astor. Gracie asked the crew if he and Astor could board a boat to protect the women. The officer looked at Astor, the richest man in the world, and said simply, "No men are allowed in these boats." Astor didn't argue. He asked for the boat number so he could find his wife later. His compliance is tragic, but it also highlights the effectiveness of the psychological trap. He was a prisoner of his own status, but the most damning witness might be the one who wasn't allowed to speak freely. Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, the man at the wheel, the man who steered the ship into the ice. After the disaster, Hitchens was a broken man. He was kept isolated, given a low-profile job, and allegedly threatened with ruin if he spoke to the press. He later claimed that the order he was given was not just a mistake, but a fundamental failure of the ship's command structure. His life dissolved into alcoholism and attempted murder, a trajectory common among those who carry the burden of a secret they cannot share. Was Hitchens paid for his silence? The conspiracy theory suggests that the steering error, turning the wheel the wrong way due to confusion between tiller and rudder commands, was a fabricated story used to explain the collision without admitting to the intentional speed. And what of the locked gates? The inquiry concluded that third-class passengers were not intentionally locked below, but rather trapped by a confusing layout. Yet survivors like Daniel Buckley testified that he and others had to smash their way through locked gates to reach the upper decks. If the conspiracy was to eliminate the powerful men in first class, the collateral damage of the 500 other souls was a necessary evil. Locking the gates, or at least failing to unlock them, ensured that the chaos of the lower decks didn't spill up onto the boat deck and disrupt the controlled evacuation of the elite women and the controlled containment of the elite men. The inquiry's final report was a masterpiece of exoneration. It blamed the speed but called it customary. It blamed the ice, calling it an act of God. It blamed the Californian, pinning the moral failure on Captain Lord. It exonerated the White Star Line of all negligence. It exonerated J.P. Morgan of any involvement. It was a verdict that allowed the insurance money to be paid and the Federal Reserve legislation to proceed without a scandal involving its primary architect. But the voices of the witnesses linger in the margins, refusing to be edited out. The shots fired in the dark, the mystery ship turning its back, the officers blocking the way, the locked gates. These are the fragments of the true story, the raw footage that was cut from the final film. They tell us that the night was not a romantic tragedy, but a brutal, managed containment operation. And the witnesses who saw the machinery of the crime were left to scream into the wind, their testimonies drowning in the official ink of the history books. A century later, the crime scene is still there. It lies 2.5 miles down, shrouded in a darkness so absolute that it feels heavy, a crushing black void where the pressure is 6,000 pounds per square inch. Here in the abyssal plain of the North Atlantic, the RMS Titanic sits upright in the sediment, rusting, weeping and waiting For decades she was lost to the world, a ghost story existing only in memory. But today, we do not need to rely on the faded memories of survivors or the sanitized reports of Lord Mersey. We have the lens of the present. We have technology that allows us to strip away the water and examine the corpse of the ship with the cold, impartial eye of forensic science. And what we find in the deep challenges the accident theory in ways that the conspirators of 1912 could never have anticipated. When Robert Ballard discovered the wreck in 1985, the first lie of the official inquiry was instantly exposed. The British investigation had concluded, based on Lightoller's testimony, that the ship sank intact. This was crucial for the White Star Line's reputation. A ship that breaks apart implies structural weakness, but Ballard's cameras revealed the truth. The ship had snapped in half. The violence of the break, the stern torn from the bow, the steel twisted like taffy, spoke of catastrophic structural failure. This was the first scientific crack in the company's defense. But the real forensic breakthrough comes from modern metallurgy and high-resolution imaging. In recent years, researchers have turned their attention to the rivets, the 3 million small iron pins that held the ship's steel plates together. In 1912, the assumption was that the steel plates had ripped open. But forensic analysis of rivets recovered from the seafloor tells a different story. Metallurgists like Timothy Folk have discovered that the rivets used in the bow and stern were made of best iron, not the superior best iron. These rivets contained a dangerously high concentration of slag, glassy residue that makes the iron brittle. Under the microscope of the present, this looks less like a mistake and more like a calculated vulnerability. In the freezing water of the Atlantic, that slag-heavy iron would have become as brittle as glass. When the iceberg applied pressure, the rivets didn't stretch. They popped. The heads sheared off, unzipping the hull plates. In the context of our conspiracy, this is the glass jaw of the Titanic. Did the builders at Harland and Wolff, under pressure from Morgan's Trust to cut costs, or perhaps under darker instructions, use substandard materials in the critical impact zones? It turned a minor collision into a terminal wound. The ship was literally built to fail under stress. Then there is the evidence of the fire. For decades, the coal fire in Boiler Room 6 was a footnote. But recently, journalists and researchers like Sinan Molony have used digital enhancement on photographs of the Titanic, taken before she left Southampton. They found something the naked eye had missed for 100 years, a 30-foot-long dark smear on the starboard side of the hull. This black mark aligns perfectly with the location of the coal bunker fire. The implications are staggering. The fire had been burning so hot and for so long that it had likely deformed the steel of the hull before the ship even picked up a passenger. Modern engineering models suggest that the heat would have reduced the structural integrity of the steel in that section by up to 75%. And where did the iceberg strike exactly on that weakened spot? Through the lens of the present, the collision takes on a sinister geometry. The ship didn't just hit an iceberg, it hit an iceberg with its most compromised section, a section weakened by a fire that was kept secret from the passengers on a ship held together by brittle rivets. It transforms the freak accident into a precision strike on a pre-softened target. If J.P. Morgan knew about the fire, and as the owner, receiving daily cable updates, he almost certainly did. Then sending the ship out at full speed wasn't negligence, it was reckless endangerment, bordering on intent. The most recent advancements in scanning technology have further stripped the ocean of its secrets. In 2023, deep-sea mapping company Magellan produced the first full-size digital twin of the Titanic. By mapping every millimeter of the wreck, they created a model that removes the water entirely. This dry view of the Titanic reveals the sheer devastation of the stern section. While the bow glided down, the stern imploded. The air pockets trapped inside detonated under the water pressure, ripping the structure apart. This visualization helps us understand the speed of the sinking. The ship didn't just fill up, she failed catastrophically. The internal venting systems, the pumps, the bulkheads, modern fluid dynamics simulations show that once the unzipping of the rivets began, the ship was doomed mathematically. There was no saving her. This reinforces the idea that the lack of lifeboats was the true lethal mechanism. The ship was a machine designed to sink fast enough to ensure that rescue was impossible for those left behind. Even the debris field tells a story. The confetti of the wreck, shoes, suitcases, unopened champagne bottles, porcelain doll heads, creates a map of human loss. But among the debris there are no binoculars. The crow's nest locker, if it could be found and opened, remains one of the holy grails of the investigation. If the binoculars are there, tucked away, it proves the lost key story. If the locker is empty, it raises the question, where did they go? The remoteness of the site has protected the evidence, but it is also destroying it. The wreck is being consumed by RMS Titanic, a rust-eating bacteria discovered on the ship itself. The Titanic is dissolving. The rusticles, icicle-like formations of rust, are dripping the ship's iron back into the ocean. The forensic window is closing. Within a few decades, the hull will collapse entirely, burying the secrets of the rivets and the fire damage under tons of unrecognizable scrap. But for now, the science is clear. The Titanic was not the invincible fortress it was claimed to be. It was a flawed vessel, weakened by fire, held together by brittle iron, and driven into a kill zone. The accident required a cascade of failures so precise that it defies statistical probability. The lens of the present does not show us a tragedy of nature. It shows us a tragedy of engineering, where every safety margin was shaved down to the razor's edge. For the investigators of the Federal Reserve conspiracy, the wreck is the ultimate exhibit. It proves that the weapon, the ship itself, was primed to break. The iceberg was just the bullet. The ship was the gun, loaded, cocked, and placed in the hands of a captain who was ordered to pull the trigger. And as the ROV lights sweep over the ghost-white teacups and the twisted davits, we are looking at the remnants of a crime scene that was designed to destroy itself, leaving nothing behind but the silence of the deep. When we strip away the romance of the film and the fog of the unavoidable tragedy, and when we align the forensic evidence of the rivets, the fire, and the ice with the political motives of 1912, a cohesive narrative emerges. It is the strongest hypothesis of the crime, a theory that connects the boardroom to the boiler room with a terrifying logic. It posits that the sinking of the Titanic was not an assassination in the conventional sense, a bomb or a bullet, but a probability trap. It was a murder committed by manipulating the variables of risk until disaster became a mathematical certainty. The narrative begins 2 years prior at the Jekyll Island Club. Here, the architects of the Federal Reserve realize that their plan for a centralized banking system faces an insurmountable wall: the old money triumvirate of Astor, Strauss, and Guggenheim. These men possess the liquidity to operate outside the trust and the political clout to block the legislation in Washington. They cannot be bribed, and they cannot be bullied. They must be removed from the board. The weapon chosen is the Titanic. As the owner of the International Mercantile Marine Company, J.P. Morgan controls the environment completely. He constructs a vessel that is marketed as the safest ship in history, a floating lifeboat, specifically to lure these cautious, high-status targets on board. They are invited to the maiden voyage not as guests, but as prisoners of a gilded cage. The setup is methodical. The ship is weakened before she sails. The fire in Boiler Room 6 is allowed to burn, compromising the tensile strength of the hull plates in the exact sector where a collision is most likely to occur. The rivets used in the bow are of inferior quality, laced with slag, turning the ship's skin into a brittle shell that will shatter rather than bend. The binoculars are removed from the crow's nest, blinding the lookouts. These are not accidents. They are the removal of the safety margins. Morgan books his own passage to sell the illusion of safety, then cancels at the 11th hour, removing his person and his priceless art. He leaves his rival, the money trust opposition, on the ship. He places his employee, Bruce Ismay, on board to act as the enforcer of the schedule. Ismay's role is to ensure the ship maintains a reckless speed, creating the kinetic energy necessary for a fatal impact. The fire provides the operational cover for this speed. The coal must be burned fast to control the flames, forcing the engines to run high. As the ship enters the ice field on April 14th, the trap is sprung. The wireless operators, employees of a company deeply tied to the financial establishment, prioritize commercial traffic over safety, burying the Misaba warning that would have forced the ship to slow down. The ship is driven blind at full speed into a known kill zone. The collision is the variable they cannot fully control, but they have stacked the deck to ensure that if a collision occurs, it is catastrophic. The glancing blow tears open the fire-weakened hull. The brittle rivets unzip. The ship begins to die. Here, the company man protocol takes over. Captain Smith, perhaps realizing too late that he has been used, follows the company line. Avoid panic. A panic would be dangerous. An orderly evacuation is lethal. The women and children first rule is enforced with a rigidity that targets the specific demographic of the enemies. Astor, Strauss, and Guggenheim are men of the Edwardian code. The conspirators know their psychological profiles. They know Astor will not fight for a seat. They know Strauss will not leave his wife. They know Guggenheim will accept his fate with dignity. The social contract of 1912 becomes the executioner. The lack of lifeboats is the failsafe. It ensures that once the ship is mortally wounded, there is no escape for the men left behind. The Californian, positioned nearby under Captain Lord, is the witness ship. It is there to monitor the situation, perhaps to pick up Ismay or specific assets if possible, but ultimately to ensure that the targets do not survive. When the rockets fire, Lord does not move. He holds his position, the silent sentinel, waiting for the lights to go out. The result is a clean sweep. The three most powerful opponents of the Federal Reserve drown in the freezing Atlantic. Their bodies and their political influence are erased. The inquiry that follows is a managed event, a whitewash led by establishment figures who ensure that the White Star Line is exonerated and Morgan's name is kept out of the papers. The steering error and misunderstood signals are introduced to muddy the waters. In the aftermath, the resistance to the central bank collapses. The path is clear. 20 months later, the Federal Reserve Act is signed. The money trust seizes control of the U.S. economy, a control they maintain to this day. This hypothesis is strong because it requires no supernatural leaps. It relies on the cold application of power. It suggests that Morgan didn't need to control the iceberg. He only needed to control the ship, the speed, the regulations, and the rescue. He built a machine that was designed to fail, put his enemies inside, and sent it into the dark. It was the perfect crime because it used the vanity of the victims and the cruelty of nature as the murder weapons. In this version of history, the Titanic is not a tragedy. It is a coup d'etat, and the 1,500 souls who perished in the water were merely the collateral damage required to change the financial destiny of the world. It is a terrifying narrative, not because it is impossible, but because it is entirely brutally logical. In the court of history, a prosecutor must also be a defender of the truth, however mundane it may be. While the Federal Reserve hypothesis offers a seductive, cohesive explanation for the tragedy, a narrative where everything happens for a reason, honest investigation requires us to examine the counter-evidence. We must ask the difficult question, could a disaster this perfect simply be a disaster? The counter-hypothesis suggests that the Titanic was not the victim of a grand banking conspiracy, but of something far more common and perhaps even more terrifying, the Swiss cheese model of systemic failure, where a dozen minor acts of human incompetence aligned to create a single, catastrophic hole in the safety net. Mainstream maritime historians argue that the conspiracy theory collapses under the weight of its own complexity. To execute a premeditated sinking, Morgan would have needed the complicity of hundreds of people, from the Harland and Wolff shipbuilders to the stokers in the boiler rooms, from the wireless operators to the officers on the bridge. In the century since the sinking, not a single deathbed confession, not a single leaked document, and not a single verifiable payoff has ever surfaced to confirm a plot. Secrets, especially those involving the murder of 1,500 people, are notoriously difficult to keep. The silence that conspiracy theorists interpret as a cover-up may in fact be the simple silence of innocence. Let us re-examine the motive. The idea that Astor, Strauss, and Guggenheim were the trinity of opposition to the Federal Reserve is a narrative that has been retroactively constructed. Historical records show a much murkier reality. Isidor Straus, for instance, was actually a proponent of banking reform and had spoken in favor of currency elasticity, the very principle behind the Federal Reserve. He was not a sworn enemy of the concept. Colonel Astor, while wealthy, was not a major political player in banking legislation. His interests were in real estate. Benjamin Guggenheim was a playboy whose business interests were scattered. There is no record of him actively lobbying against the Federal Reserve Act. The idea that these three men alone could have stopped the legislation is a dramatic exaggeration of their political power. The Federal Reserve had broad support in Congress and was the result of a political process that had been grinding forward for years, regardless of who sat in the first-class dining saloon. Then there is the matter of J.P. Morgan's cancellation. While suspicious, it is not inexplicable. Morgan was 75 years old. He was indeed unwell, suffering from the exhaustion that would kill him less than a year later. His decision to stay in France to enjoy the spa treatments at Aix-les-Bains is consistent with the behavior of a wealthy, elderly man prioritizing his comfort over a symbolic voyage. Furthermore, he wasn't the only tycoon to cancel. Henry Clay Frick and the Vanderbilts also booked and then cancelled suites on the Titanic. Were they all in on the plot? Or is it simply that the ultra-wealthy often change their travel plans on a whim? The sabotage evidence also faces scrutiny. The coal fire in Boiler Room 6, while real, was not unique. Coal bunker fires were a common occurrence on steamships of that era. The crew knew how to manage them. You shovel the burning coal into the furnace. It was a standard operational hazard, not a planted bomb. Modern finite element analysis suggests that while the heat might have softened the steel, the iceberg's impact force was so massive, thousands of tons of displacement energy, that it would have breached the hull regardless of the fire damage. The ship didn't need to be weakened to sink. Physics alone was enough. Regarding the speed and the ice, Captain Smith's behavior was not reckless by the standards of 1912. It was standard operating procedure. The prevailing maritime wisdom of the time was that if the weather was clear, you maintained speed to get out of the danger zone as quickly as possible. Lookouts were expected to spot ice in time to turn. This methodology had worked for decades. Smith wasn't driving the ship into a trap. He was driving it exactly how he had driven every other ship in his 40-year career. He was guilty of complacency, yes, and of trusting outdated practices, but that is a professional failure, not a criminal one. The lost binoculars are another point of contention. Experienced mariners argue that on a moonless, pitch-black night, binoculars are actually useless for spotting objects. They narrow the field of view. The naked eye is better for scanning the horizon for the blacking out of stars that indicates an iceberg. Fleet and Lee likely wouldn't have seen the berg any sooner, even with the glasses. The collision was dictated by the atmospheric conditions, the calm sea and the lack of moon, not by a missing key. And what of the Californian? Captain Lord's inaction is indefensible, but it is likely the result of incompetence and fear rather than malice. He was a cautious captain who had stopped his ship precisely because he was terrified of the ice. When he saw rockets, his hesitation likely stemmed from a paralyzing confusion and a reluctance to wake his wireless operator, a breakdown of command, not a sinister adherence to a witness protocol. He was a bad captain on a bad night, not a hired gun. The rivets, too, tell a story of context. The use of best iron was an industry standard for civilian ships. Best iron was reserved for warships. Harland and Wolff were building a liner for profit, not a battleship for combat. The brittle rivets were a result of cost-cutting and supply chain issues, a mundane corporate vice, not a murderous one. The counter-hypothesis presents a tragedy that is, in some ways, more disturbing than the conspiracy. It suggests that the Titanic didn't sink because of an evil genius. It sank because of the banality of error. It sank because regulations were 18 years out of date. It sank because wireless operators were overworked employees of a private company rather than public safety officers. It sank because the steel of 1912 was brittle in the cold. It sank because men were arrogant enough to believe they had conquered nature. In this version, there is no villain twirling a mustache in a dark room. There is only a system of acceptable risks that finally collapsed. The death of Astor, Strauss, and Guggenheim was not a strategic strike, but a random, cruel roll of the dice. They died not because they were enemies of the Federal Reserve, but because they were men of honor in a situation where honor was a death sentence. We are left with two competing narratives. One is a tight, logical, terrifying plot of assassination and financial coups. The other is a messy, chaotic, heartbreaking accumulation of mistakes. The conspiracy appeals to our desire for order, to believe that such a massive event must have a massive cause. But the counter-hypothesis forces us to confront the reality that chaos is the true ruler of the ocean. Sometimes the only conspiracy is the one between arrogance and ice. And on April 14th, that alliance was strong enough to break the world. The climax of a conspiracy is not the explosion. It is the moment the lock clicks shut. It is the instant when the theoretical plan becomes a physical prison from which there is no escape. On the Titanic, this moment did not occur when the ice struck the hull. It occurred 45 minutes later, in the quiet, brightly lit chart room behind the bridge. This was where the probability trap transformed into a death sentence. At 12:15 a.m., Thomas Andrews, the ship's architect, looked up from his blueprints and delivered the verdict that the conspirators had counted on. The mathematics of the flooding were inexorable. The ship was not just damaged, she was murdered. "She has an hour," Andrews told Captain Smith. "An hour and a half at most. In a standard disaster, this would be the moment of panic, but in the context of the Federal Reserve hypothesis, this was the moment of execution. The weapon was no longer the iceberg. The weapon was the evacuation procedure. The ship had 200 people on board and lifeboat space for 178. But even that number was a theoretical maximum. The reality was that the women and children first protocol, a social custom, not a maritime law, was about to be weaponized. It was the perfect filter. It ensured that the wives of the powerful would be saved, preserving the wealth. But the men, the obstacles, the politicians, the financiers, would be kept on the deck by their own sense of honor. The evacuation began not with a scream, but with a whisper. Captain Smith ordered the lifeboats uncovered and the passengers mustered, but he gave the order quietly. There was no general alarm. No siren wailed across the ocean. This silence was the final lock on the cage. By keeping the passengers calm, the crew ensured that the targets did not realize they were in a fight for their lives until the boats were already gone. On the boat deck, the scene played out like a slow-motion tragedy. The air was biting cold, but the deck was level and the lights were blazing. It felt safer on the ship than in the small, fragile wooden boats swinging from the davits. This illusion was fatal. John Jacob Astor IV, the richest man on the ship and the primary target of the alleged plot, stood by Lifeboat 4. He was calm. He had helped his young, pregnant wife, Madeline, into the boat. He turned to the officer in charge, Second Officer Lightoller, and asked a simple question. "May I join my wife?" He mentioned her delicate condition. In any other circumstance, a man of Astor's power could have demanded a seat, but Lightoller, enforcing the strict interpretation of the company's orders, replied, "No men are allowed in these boats until the women are loaded." Astor did not argue. He did not offer a bribe. He did not use his physical strength to force his way past the officer. He simply stepped back, touched his cap, and asked for the boat number so he could find her later. He lit a cigarette and tossed his gloves to his wife. He had just accepted his own execution because the social code of his era demanded it. The conspiracy had successfully used his own gentility against him. A few yards away, the second target, Isidor Strauss, was dismantling the conspiracy's need for force with his own moral fortitude. He was offered a seat in a lifeboat because of his advanced age, but Strauss looked around, saw younger men stepping back, and refused. "I will not go before the other men," he declared. His wife, Ida, who had already boarded Lifeboat 8, climbed back out. She walked to her husband and took his arm. "We have lived together for many years," she said. "Where you go, I go." They sat down on a pair of deck chairs holding hands, two immovable objects in a dissolving world. They were not victims of panic. They were volunteers for martyrdom. Benjamin Guggenheim, the third obstacle, realized the game was up. He returned to his cabin, removed his lifebelt and heavy sweater, and changed into his evening tailcoat and white tie. He reappeared on deck. looking like he was heading to a gala. "We are dressed in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen," he told a steward. It was a defiant gesture, a signal that while the conspirators could take his life, they could not strip him of his dignity. He stood in the foyer of the grand staircase, sipping brandy, watching the water creep up the steps. While the targets were resigning themselves to death, the company man was making his move. J. Bruce Ismay, the representative of the Morgan Trust, the man who had pushed for speed, found himself near collapsible Boat C. The boat was lowering. There were no women or children in the immediate vicinity. In that split second, the women and children first rule evaporated for him. He stepped into the boat. As he was lowered away from the dying ship, he turned his back, unable to watch the Leviathan he had helped destroy sink into the abyss. His survival would brand him a coward forever, but in the logic of the conspiracy, he was simply the asset that had been retrieved. The job was done, the targets were secured on the deck. The agent was clear. By 2:00 a.m., the last lifeboat had departed. The probability trap had worked with 100% efficiency. The deck of the Titanic was now a waiting room for death. The tilt of the ship grew steep. The roar of the steam venting from the funnels made conversation difficult. The band, led by Wallace Hartley, continued to play. They had switched from ragtime to hymns, "Nearer, My God, to Thee," or perhaps "Autumn." The music drifted over the water, a surreal soundtrack to the final act of the crime. Astor was last seen smoking on the starboard wing of the bridge, waiting. Strauss was sitting calmly with Ida. Guggenheim was inside, surrounded by the opulence that had been his cage. The lights of the ship flickered, once, twice, and then stayed on, burning red and dim as the dynamos failed. At 2:17 a.m., the structural failure occurred. The ship groaned, a sound described by survivors as a long tearing thunder. The bow, heavy with water, pulled the stern up until the steel keel could no longer support the weight. The ship snapped. The violence of the break separated the men on the stern from the sanctuary of the bow, and then the silence returned. The stern section bobbed for a moment, like a cork, before flooding and sliding beneath the surface. The three men who stood in the way of the Federal Reserve were gone. They had not been shot. They had not been poisoned. They had simply been placed in a situation where their own character, combined with a rigged environment, ensured they would not survive. From the lifeboats, the survivors watched the unsinkable ship disappear. To them it was a tragedy of nature, but to the eyes of a cold investigation, it was the successful conclusion of a business transaction. The obstacles were removed, the water smoothed over the crime scene, and on the Carpathia, the wireless operators began to tap out the list of the saved, a list that J.P. Morgan, sitting in France, would scan with great interest, looking for the names that were conveniently, profitably missing. When a crime is committed on the scale of a geopolitical maneuver, the perpetrators calculate the cost in dollars, influence, and stock options. But the true invoice of the Titanic conspiracy was paid in a different currency entirely, the destruction of human lineages. As the sun rose on April 15th, painting the iceberg-strewn ocean in deceptive shades of pink and gold, the magnitude of the collateral damage began to reveal itself. The sinking didn't just end lives, it detonated families, erasing futures that were just beginning to take shape. For the primary targets of the alleged plot, the consequences were immediate and dynastic. Madeleine Astor, the 18-year-old bride of John Jacob Astor IV, sat in Lifeboat 4, shivering under a fur coat that suddenly felt too heavy. She was 5 months pregnant. In the span of a few hours, she had gone from being the wife of the most powerful landowner in America to a dowager carrying a fatherless heir. When she arrived in New York, she was met not by her husband, but by a wall of silence and lawyers. Astor's body was recovered days later by the cable ship Mackay Bennett. He was identified by the initials on his collar and the $4 Iron dollars in cash in his pocket, money that was now useless. His death triggered a massive transfer of wealth. His fortune, which the conspiracy theory posits was the bulwark against the Federal Reserve, was fractured and distributed. His son, Vincent, inherited the bulk of the estate, but Vincent was young and lacked the seasoned political hardened edge of his father. The Astor wall that might have stopped the central bank had crumbled. Madeline gave birth to a son, John Jacob Astor VI, in August. He would be known as the Titanic baby, a living relic of the night his father was sacrificed for a new economic order. The grief of the Strauss family was less about money and more about the void left by a moral anchor. Isidore's body was found and brought back to New York for a funeral attended by 40 Zollern people. But Ida was never found. The ocean kept her. The image of the empty seat beside Isidore's grave became a powerful symbol of the cruelty of the event. Their deaths removed a voice of ethical capitalism from the American conversation. Isidore had been a man who believed in fair trade and honest money. Without him, the path was clearer for the more ruthless, abstract financial systems that the Federal Reserve would introduce. But a conspiracy of this size creates a blast radius that destroys the innocent just as thoroughly as the intended targets. The collateral damage in the lower decks was horrific. The Sage family, traveling in third class, were moving from England to Florida to start a pecan farm. John and Annie Sage had 9 children, ranging from 4 to 20 years old. They were a microcosm of the immigrant dream. When the gates were locked or when the confusion became too great, they missed their chance. None of them survived. 11 members of a single family were wiped off the face of the earth in one night. Were they enemies of the Federal Reserve? No. They were simply the friction in the machine, the human cost of a business decision made in a boardroom thousands of miles away. The Allison family in first class suffered a particularly haunting fate. Hudson and Bessie Allison were traveling with their 2 children, Lorraine and Trevor. In the chaos, they lost track of their infant son, Trevor, who had been taken to a boat by his nursemaid. Frantic, refusing to leave the ship without their baby, the parents stayed behind with their daughter, Lorraine. Lorraine Allison became the only child in first class to die. Her death destroys the gentlemanly narrative of the sinking. It shows that the probability trap was indiscriminate. Once the safety margins were removed, the chaos consumed everyone, regardless of their station. The cruelty of the aftermath was codified by the White Star Line's corporate policy. In a move that supports the theory of a cold, calculated operation, the company stopped the wages of the crew at 2:20 a.m., the precise moment the ship sank. The surviving crew members, shivering on the Carpathia, were technically unemployed from the moment their feet got wet. The widows of the crew in Southampton, who lived paycheck to paycheck, were plunged into immediate destitution. This bureaucratic heartlessness aligns with the profile of a conspiracy born of pure profit. The company didn't just kill the workers, it billed them for the time they stopped working. In Southampton, the silence was deafening. In one school, half the class had lost a father. The Northam district was decimated. These were the families of the stokers, the stewards, the firemen, the men who had unknowingly fueled the conspiracy's weapon. They were given no answers, only a small payout from a relief fund that barely covered the rent. The Titanic Relief Fund became a charity case, while the insurance payout for the ship itself went into the corporate accounts of the International Mercantile Marine Company. Then there is the psychological ruin of the survivors. J. Bruce Ismay, the company man who escaped in collapsible sea, physically survived, but his life was effectively over. He was pilloried by the press, branded the coward of the Titanic, and shunned by society. He retired to a secluded life in Ireland, a ghost haunting his own estate. Was his disgrace part of the plan? Was he the fall guy, the lightning rod designated to absorb the public's anger, while Morgan and the true architects remained in the shadows? Ismay never spoke publicly about the orders he may have received. He carried the secrets of the voyage to his grave, a broken man who served his purpose and was discarded. The survivors also suffered from what we now call survivor's guilt, but which in 1912 was a nameless, crushing weight. Men who had survived, like Carter or Pushen, were often ostracized. "Why are you here when Astor is dead?" was the unspoken question in every club in New York. The conspiracy had inverted the natural order. The best men had died, and the rats had scurried off. This narrative served the conspirators well. By framing the survivors as cowards and the dead as heroes, they deflected attention from the cause of the sinking. The public was too busy judging the morality of the survivors to question the mechanics of the disaster. The human consequences of the Titanic extend to the legal battles that followed. The families of the third-class victims faced a legal system rigged against them. The liability laws of the time allowed the White Star Line to limit their total payout to the value of the salvage, which, in this case, was the lifeboats and the freight earnings. The total value was assessed at a fraction of the ship's worth. Families who had lost everything received pennies on the dollar. The Sage family, 11 lives lost, received a settlement that amounted to an insult. This legal firewall protected the Morgan Trust's assets from being drained by lawsuits. It was the final layer of the shield, a legal structure that valued a lifeboat more than a steerage passenger. As the years passed, the trauma did not fade, it metastasized. The children of the Titanic, the orphans of the storm, grew up in the shadow of the event. The tragedy shaped their psychology, their fear of water, their distrust of authority. The Titanic baby, John Jacob Astor 6, lived a life of restless privilege, never stepping out of the shadow of the father he never knew. The loss of Astor 4 didn't just remove a financier, it altered the trajectory of one of America's great families, initiating a slow decline that mirrored the fading of the old money era. The human cost of the Titanic was a tapestry of individual apocalypses, but in the cold calculus of the conspiracy, these thousands of broken lives were merely the overhead costs of the operation. To the men who wanted the Federal Reserve, the grieving widows in Southampton and the fatherless heir in New York were acceptable losses. They had reshaped the financial destiny of the world, and if the price was a few thousand nightmares, they were willing to let others pay it. The ocean washed away the tears just as easily as it washed away the blood. If the sinking of the Titanic was the crime, the official inquiries that followed were the getaway car. In the wake of a disaster that claimed 500 lives, the public demanded answers, but the powerful demanded silence. What unfolded in the hearing rooms of New York and London was not a search for truth, but a masterclass in bureaucratic theater designed to protect the very institutions that had engineered the catastrophe. The investigation was, in reality, a containment operation, ensuring that the conspiracy to clear the path for the Federal Reserve remained buried beneath a mountain of nautical technicalities. The first act of this legal drama opened in New York at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel under the gavel of Senator William Alden Smith. Smith was a Republican from Michigan, a man with no maritime experience but a bulldog's instinct for corruption. He was the wild card the conspirators hadn't fully accounted for. Unlike his British counterparts, Smith didn't care about the etiquette of the high seas. He cared about the money trust. He smelled the sulfur of corporate malfeasance. Smith's inquiry moved with a speed that terrified the White Star Line. He subpoenaed the surviving crew before they could leave the country. He grilled J. Bruce Ismay with a ferocity that left the shipping magnate stuttering. Smith asked the questions that the establishment wanted to avoid. Who owned the ship? Was there a secret order to break the speed record? Why was the ice warning ignored? He even dared to probe the financial structure of the International Mercantile Marine Company, inching dangerously close to the name J.P. Morgan. But Smith was fighting a war he couldn't win. The press, particularly the British papers, launched a vicious campaign to discredit him. They mocked his lack of nautical knowledge, calling him a backwoodsman who asked if the Titanic had watertight compartments in the lifeboats. This ridicule was a strategic distraction. By painting Smith as a fool, the media, controlled largely by the same financial interests he was investigating, ensured that his dangerous questions about ownership and motive were dismissed as the ramblings of an incompetent politician. Crucially, the one man Smith needed to put under oath never appeared. J.P. Morgan, the owner of the ship and the architect of the alleged plot, remained totally insulated. He was not dragged before the committee. He was not forced to explain his last-minute cancellation or the removal of his art. In a conspiracy of this magnitude, the silence of the kingpin is the loudest testimony. Smith could shout at the stewards, but he could not touch the emperor. Across the Atlantic, the British Wreck Commissioner's inquiry was a far more polished and far more corrupt affair. It was presided over by Lord Mersey, a man who was the living embodiment of the British establishment. Mersey's mandate was implicit but clear: protect the reputation of the British Merchant Marine and, by extension, the Board of Trade regulations that had allowed the ship to sail with too few boats. If White Star was found negligent, the British government would be complicit. Lord Mersey didn't conduct an investigation, he conducted a whitewash. The proceedings were stacked with lawyers representing the Board of Trade and the White Star Line. The victims, the third-class passengers, the widows, the orphans, had almost no representation. The strategy in London was containment by technicality. When witnesses tried to speak of the third ship or the mystery lights, Mersey shut them down or steered the conversation elsewhere. The inquiry was terrified of the third ship theory because it implied a witness to the crime, a vessel that might have been part of the plot. Instead, Mersey focused all the blame on Captain Lord of the Californian. Lord was the perfect scapegoat, a captain who had done nothing. By vilifying Lord, the inquiry successfully diverted attention from the structural failures of the Titanic and the corporate orders that sent her into the ice. Captain Lord was crucified in the press so that J. Bruce Ismay and J. P. Morgan could walk free. The testimony regarding the gunshots was also aggressively suppressed. When steerage passengers tried to testify about officers shooting into the crowd, the questions were deflected. The inquiry could not allow the narrative of a riot to take hold. It had to maintain the illusion of a British gentleman's disaster, where everyone waited their turn. Admitting that officers had to execute passengers to maintain the women and children first filter, the filter that kept Astor and Strauss on board, would have exposed the brutality of the trap. But the most glaring omission was the forensic evidence. The inquiry accepted, almost without question, the theory that the ship sank intact. Second Officer Lightoller's testimony that she did not break became the official truth. Why? Because a ship that breaks is a weak ship. A ship that sinks intact is a victim of overwhelming circumstance. Admitting the break would have opened the door to questions about the rivets, the steel quality, and the fire in Boiler Room 6, questions that led directly back to the cost-cutting and negligence of the Morgan Trust. The final verdict of the British inquiry was a masterpiece of legal fiction. It concluded that the Titanic was traveling at excessive speed, but, and this is the key phrase, that this speed was customary practice and therefore not negligent. It was a verdict that said, you did the wrong thing, but since everyone does it, you are innocent. White Star was exonerated. The Board of Trade was exonerated. J.P. Morgan was never even mentioned as a liability. The insurance money, totaling millions of dollars, was paid out in full to the International Mercantile Marine Company. The financial loss of the ship was covered, and the financial gain of the upcoming Federal Reserve Act was secured. The official investigation effectively closed the book on the conspiracy. It turned a mass casualty event into a procedural error. It accepted the accident narrative and stamped it with the seal of the British Empire. It buried the ice warnings, the missing binoculars, the fire, and the convenient cancellations under thousands of pages of dry, legal transcript. In the end, the inquiries achieved exactly what a cleanup crew is supposed to achieve. They sanitized the crime scene, they discredited the witnesses, they framed a patsy, and they ensured that the men who benefited most from the disaster, the bankers who would soon seize control of the American economy, never had to answer a single question about why the only men who could have stopped them ended up at the bottom of the Atlantic. The gavel fell, the case was closed, and the Federal Reserve was open for business. A century later, the Titanic has ceased to be a ship. It has transcended its physical form of steel and rivets to become a modern mythology, a canvas onto which we project our deepest fears about technology, hubris, and power. But for those who view the disaster through the lens of the Federal Reserve conspiracy, the meaning of the case has shifted fundamentally. It is no longer a story about the tragedy of death. It is a story about the cost of birth. It is the violent, freezing origin story of the 20th century economic order. To understand the new meaning of the case, we must look at the world that emerged from the water after the Titanic went down. The old world, the world of Astor, Strauss, and Guggenheim, was one of tangible value. It was a world where wealth was measured in land, in gold, in retail goods, in copper mines. It was an economy built on things you could touch. These men were the kings of the concrete. But the world that replaced it, the world championed by J.P. Morgan and the architects of the Federal Reserve, was a world of abstraction. It was a world of fiat currency, of central banking, of debt, of credit, of invisible flows of capital that could be manipulated from a boardroom in Washington or New York. The sinking of the Titanic was the watershed moment between these two epochs. When the ship went down, the hard money resistance went down with it. The legislation that followed in 1913 didn't just create a bank. It fundamentally altered the relationship between the American citizen and their money. It centralized power in a way that the Founding Fathers had explicitly feared. If the conspiracy holds true, then the Titanic was the sacrificial altar upon which the modern global economy was consecrated. Every dollar in your pocket today, every shift in interest rates, every boom and bust cycle of the last 100 years carries the faint, cold echo of that night in the North Atlantic. This perspective transforms the Titanic from a disaster into a coup. It suggests that the chaos of the 20th century, the wars funded by central banks, the Great Depression, the consolidation of corporate power, was not accidental, but the result of a specific trajectory set in motion when the Californian turned its back on the dying ship. The new meaning of the case is that we are living in the timeline created by the conspirators. We are the inheritors of the world J.P. Morgan wanted. But the case has also taken on a new cultural resonance in the 21st century. In 1912, the public was angry, but they were also naive. They trusted institutions. They believed that inquiries were meant to find the truth. Today, we live in an era of deep institutional distrust. We have seen government cover-ups, corporate malfeasance, and financial crimes that destroyed economies without a single banker going to jail. The Titanic conspiracy resonates now more than ever because we understand the too big to fail mentality. We understand that for the ultra-elite, people are just numbers on a balance sheet. The idea that a corporation would sacrifice 500 lives to secure $1 trillion future no longer feels like the plot of a villain. It feels like a cynical business strategy. The wreck itself has become a symbol of this hidden truth, as the Halomonas titanici bacteria eats away at the steel. Dissolving the physical evidence, the Titanic is becoming a ghost in the literal sense. The crime scene is vanishing. This deterioration adds a sense of urgency to the investigation. We are racing against entropy. The collapsed decks, the missing binoculars, the fire-damaged hull. Soon they will all be mud. The disappearance of the ship mirrors the disappearance of the truth. It reminds us that history is fragile, that evidence rots, and that if we do not interrogate the past, the official narrative, the whitewash, becomes the only reality. Furthermore, the new meaning challenges our understanding of the heroes and villains. In the standard retelling, Captain Smith is a tragic hero, a stoic father figure. In the conspiracy analysis, he is a complicated, perhaps compromised figure, a man torn between duty to his passengers and obedience to his corporate masters. Ismay is not just a coward, he is the bagman, the operational asset who ensured the job was done. And the victims, Astor, Strauss, Guggenheim, are elevated from rich passengers to guardians. They become martyrs for a lost version of capitalism that was perhaps more humane, or at least more honest, than the system that replaced it. The case also forces us to confront the role of technology in our subjugation. The Titanic was the technological marvel of its day, the unsinkable ship. The passengers put their blind faith in the machine, believing it would protect them. Instead, the machine was the weapon. Today, as we put our faith in algorithms, in digital currencies, in artificial intelligence, the Titanic serves as a dark warning. It reminds us that technology is neutral, but the people who control it are not. The same wireless system that allowed passengers to send frivolous messages also allowed the conspirators to suppress the ice warnings. The technology did not save them, it managed them. Culturally, the Federal Reserve theory has moved from the fringe to the center of the Titanic dialogue because it answers the question that the accident theory cannot. Why? The accident theory tells us how the ship sank: ice, speed, rivets. But the human mind craves motive. We struggle to accept that something so monumental could be the result of something so trivial as a missing key or a sleepy lookout. The conspiracy offers a why that matches the scale of the event. It provides a narrative symmetry. It says that the Titanic sank not because of bad luck, but because of bad men. And in a strange way, that is almost more comforting. It implies that the world is controlled, even if by monsters, rather than being a chaotic void where 500 people can die for absolutely no reason at all. As we look at the Titanic today through the lens of modern cynicism and forensic science, the ship appears less like a romantic tragedy and more like a crime scene photo that was developed a century too late. The jewelry recovered from the wreck, the shoes of the victims, the unopened champagne bottles, they are no longer just artifacts, they are evidence. They are the silent witnesses to a night when the trajectory of the world was bent toward the consolidation of power. The new meaning of the Titanic case is that it is an open wound in history. It is a reminder that the official story is often written by the survivors, and the survivors are often the ones who boarded the lifeboats first. It challenges us to look beneath the surface, to question the coincidences, and to recognize that the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world that the Titanic was just an accident. The ship lies at the bottom of the ocean, but the questions it raises are floating on the surface, refusing to sink. We are left with a haunting realization. The ice melted long ago, but the cold intent of that night is still frozen in the bedrock of our financial world. The Titanic didn't just hit an iceberg, it hit history, and the impact is still being felt today. The ocean has a way of keeping what belongs to it. It does not bargain, it does not explain, and it does not apologize. As we stand at the rail of history, looking back at the wake of the Titanic, the water is calm again. The screams have been silent for more than a century. The ice that tore the ship open has long since melted into the anonymous salt of the Atlantic. The bodies of John Jacob Astor, Isidor Straus, and Benjamin Guggenheim have returned to the earth, leaving behind only names carved in stone and legacies that have been slowly eroded by time. But the story refuses to rest. It lingers like the smell of ozone before a storm, a persistent unease that suggests we have not been told the whole truth. We have walked through the corridors of the conspiracy, tracing the steps of men who may have been walking toward a designated doom. We have seen the fire in the coal bunker, the missing binoculars, the ignored wireless messages, and the ship that turned its back. We have looked at the empty seat of J.P. Morgan and the full lifeboats that left the targets behind. We have examined a world where a cancelled ticket might have been a signature on a death warrant, and where a collision with ice might have been the cold, hard handshake of a new financial order. Yet as with all great mysteries, certainty slips through our fingers like water. There is no signed confession locked in a vault. There is no recorded conversation of Morgan ordering the hit. We are left with a constellation of coincidences that align too perfectly to be ignored, yet remain too circumstantial to convict. The Federal Reserve conspiracy is a ghost story in the truest sense. It haunts the gaps in the official record, living in the silence between the facts. Perhaps the most terrifying possibility is not that the Titanic was sunk by a conspiracy, but that the world we live in is shaped by forces so callous that they could have done it. The story resonates because we recognize the ruthlessness of power. We know that throughout history, empires have been built on bones. Whether the Titanic was a victim of nature's cruelty or human malice, the result was the same. The old guardians fell and the new architects took their place. The Federal Reserve stands today as the central pillar of the global economy, a monument built on the timeline that began the moment the Titanic went under. As the camera of our imagination pulls back from the wreck, leaving the rusting prow in the eternal darkness of the abyss, we are left with the final image of the ship itself. It is no longer a symbol of luxury or hubris. It is a tomb. It holds the secrets of the rivets, the truth of the speed, and the final words of the men who stood on the deck and watched their world end. The band played until the water touched their feet. They didn't play for the lifeboats, they played for the people who were staying. And in that final act of grace, there is a lesson that transcends conspiracy. Whether by accident or design, We are all passengers on a ship we cannot steer, sailing through a dark ocean we cannot control. The only choice we have is how we face the music when the lights go out. The Titanic lies broken on the floor of the world, a cathedral of silence. It will eventually disappear, consumed by the bacteria and the currents. But the question of why it is there, was it fate or was it murder, will remain as long as there are people to ask it. The investigation is never truly closed. The file remains on the desk, gathering dust, but never sealed. The ocean keeps its secrets, but it also keeps our fascination. And as you drift off to sleep tonight, listening to the quiet of your own room, remember the ship that sails forever in the dark, carrying the ghosts of a future that almost was. If this investigation resonated with you, feel free to subscribe for more deep and calming explorations of Titanic's forgotten stories.